And we are happy to welcome back for the fourth of 5 consecutive appearances here on the agenda all week long, Paul Summerville, the Senior Fellow at the Center for Global Studies at the University of Victoria, former Chief Economist of RBC Capital, and currently writing a book called Canada's Excellent Future. I'm glad somebody's bullish on this country's future, and you're one of them. Paul, it's good timing to have you in here. We've obviously just finished the G8, G20 meetings here in Ontario. Good time to start talking about rethinking economics, and tonight we want to talk about the role of government and the role of regulation. And to that end, get comfortable, sir. I'm about to read a longish quote from Milton Friedman, Ronald Reagan's favorite economist. In a much-quoted passage in his inaugural address, President Kennedy said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." It is a striking sign of the temper of our times that the controversy about this passage centered on its origin and not on its content. Neither half of the statement expresses a relation between the citizen and his government that is worthy of the ideals of free men in a free society. The paternalistic, "what your country can do for you," implies that government is the patron, the citizen is the ward, a view that is at odds with the free man's belief in his own responsibility for his own destiny. The organismic "what you can do for your country" implies that government is the master or the deity, the citizen, the servant, or the votary. To the free man, the country is the collection of individuals who compose it, not something over and above them. He is proud of a common heritage and loyal to common traditions, but he regards government as a means, an instrumentality, neither a grantor of favors and gifts, nor a master or god to be blindly worshipped and served. He recognizes no national goal except as it is the consensus of the goals that the citizens severally serve. He recognizes no national purpose except as it is the consensus of the purposes for which the citizens severally strive. Okay, Milton Friedman, Capitalism and Friedman, written more than, well, it's almost 50 years ago now. How much of that do you agree with?
Not a lot, and I think it's just a very different way of thinking about the individual. Milton Friedman obviously is a very powerful, articulate, eloquent person to express the idea that the individual is really made. And there's truth in that, there's no question. But I think if you're a liberal, like me, a small L liberal, who ran for the NDP and would run for the Liberal Party today, was probably a progressive conservative when it was run by Brian Mulroney. A very different way of thinking about the individual. I'm pretty convinced, and my own life experience has confirmed this for me, is that individuals are really made, they're not born. It's Hillary Clinton's idea that it takes a village to raise a child. It's the community context, and the community context includes many things, that allows an individual to become free and independent, because that's actually the heart of liberalism. The idea is that the community doesn't restrict, doesn't steer, doesn't control the individual, but that the community creates the rule of law, creates access to quality education, creates, I think, the access to the science of good health. You can measure that in community outcomes like incarceration rates, teenage pregnancy rates, ways of measuring what's happening in the community so that they can participate in a free market economy, in an economy that will allow them to build their own lives in their own image.
Now, we know, of course, Friedman was a libertarian economist.
Sure.
Obviously did not believe in the kind of government intervention that we have in this country versus what he probably thinks the American government was far too interventionist as well.
No question.
Yeah. But let's just follow up on this. Are there certain areas of the economy which become worse off with government intervention? And if so, what are they?
Well, this is the big challenge for liberals, and it's a real moment of truth, partly because of what we're seeing in Europe right now, the whole issue about debts and deficits, but really the model that we've used to try to deal with these issues of instruments of social justice. Again, what's the rule of law, how you educate people, the degree to which you give people the access to health. In terms of what the government can do and what it can't do, it's pretty clear to me, for example, that the government should be involved in regulating the quality of food and what's in it. Milton Friedman, for example, is pretty famous for saying something like, the market should determine that.
Yeah.
You know, because if you're a food company,
Yeah.
like a Chinese milk company, for example, and you put in, I don't know, paint or something, and you create these terrible deaths, then the milk company is going to go out of business. Really bad for the executives and the shareholders. Not so great for the kids whose kidneys don't function, or the parents, you know, who lose that child. Milton Friedman's also very famous for saying, if you want to learn French, you know, go to Berlitz. Why would you go to a public school? Because Berlitz is in the business of making you fluent in French. It isn't really. A lot of language companies are in the business of trying to get you to come to the school as long as they possibly can. So there's a question about whether or not there are areas where the government plays a very important role. Where it probably ought not to be involved in is setting prices for things. For determining whether or not, you know, the tie you're wearing has those spots on it or not. We've seen the example of that. We have a laboratory of countries that decided to try to regulate the details of the marketplace. Rather than creating a framework where everyone was legal under the law, where everyone had the chance to have a good quality education, where everyone, if they got sick, had the chance to get the access to good health. That instead of that, they looked at the marketplace and said, the market's wrong. That Paul Summerville setting up a business and charging a fee for whatever it is, selling a pizza, designing a shoe, designing and selling a car, that there's something bad about that. Anytime the government has got involved in determining what we eat in terms of the very specific thing, what color our suit is, what kind of car we should drive, it's been an unmitigated disaster.
Okay, those ones are simpler. What about booze? What about television stations? Should the government be in the business of selling booze or owning a television station?
I don't think the government should be in the business of selling booze. There's lots of now it should regulate who you can sell the booze to. You might want to regulate, you know, what time of day you sell it to, but that's a very natural place for the private sector to be.
So you'd privatize the LCBO then?
Would Paul Summerville privatize the LCBO? I don't know what other things were on my agenda. You're asking me a political question.
Okay.
So the point is I don't think that the government should be selling booze. Whether I would privatize it or not would depend on many other things that I would be
dealing with.
In
principle, you don't think they need to be in that
Absolutely don't need to be there.
Huh. What areas are we better off for having the government, you know, in our faces, so to speak?
Well, I think there are some, and again, I think this is an enormously important issue for Liberals. It's what I'm writing about in my book. It's actually the second chapter. I call it Liberalism's Second Century, so Canadian social justice. So where should the government be involved? First and foremost, the rule of law. And there's evidence that we're not doing that really well.
Okay, what about economically though?
Economically, the government needs to have, well, the rule of law applies to the economy because it applies to everyone paying their taxes. It applies to the trade agreements that governments make between themselves. So again, it's where the government intervenes in the details of how the market works that generally I would disagree with. And I think most Liberals would actually disagree with.
Can governments create wealth?
Of course. Governments create wealth by, you know, it's funny, if you went up the street here to, you know, some of my friends who live in Rosedale, you know, they rail about the government and, you know, the taxes are too high and, you know, they can't get on with living the life that they really want. But, you know, they're making millions of dollars a year. They live in a really nice house. They send their kids to school without armed guards. I mentor a kid at the University of Victoria who's from Brazil, really smart kid, going to be graduating next year. So I said to him, "You going to go to Brazil?" "No, I'm not going to go back to my country." And everyone's talking about Brazil being a great place to invest. I'm thinking, well, if this smart kid who understands how markets work doesn't want to go back to his own country and live, then I don't want to invest in it. How come? Because the government isn't creating the framework, the rule of law, the educational construct.
Is that different though? Is that government creating wealth, or is that the government trying to ensure conditions under which wealth can be created?
Well, and that's it then, isn't it? I mean, the point...
That's different.
Well, so maybe when we try to ask that question, that's where we should put the bias. The bias shouldn't be that the government is in the marketplace trying to get rich, that's for entrepreneurs, that's for citizens to do. And where that happens, usually the results are bad because the government can't go out of business, which is kind of important, right? So if you're selling really lousy cars like the Lada, I visited East Germany in 1988 when I was working for Deutsche Bank. And the thing that struck me was when I went into what was supposed to be a grocery store. And I was living in Japan at the time, you know, where a banana is perfect. And these apples and oranges and potatoes, I just thought, sorry, am I like in a store that's selling food for animals? So
didn't look right.
It didn't look right. So the idea that the government can create wealth, I think, is a big mistake. Instead, it creates the conditions for wealth. And that's finding the right balance between instruments of social justice and the cost of paying for those instruments. What do our schools cost? What kind of teachers do we hire?
Okay,
that kind
in
of
which
thing.
case, let's
Sure.
look a little more laser-like then at the financial system
Okay.
here. And to that end, let's quote everybody's favorite economist, Paul Krugman.
Sure.
You like Paul Krugman, I bet. He
Some days I do, some days I don't.
Some days, okay.
Yeah.
Here's what he wrote in the New York Times back in April. Reform actually should hurt the bankers. A growing body of analysis suggests that an oversized financial industry is hurting the broader economy. Shrinking that oversized industry won't make Wall Street happy, but what's bad for Wall Street would be good for America.
Well, I think the trick really is to say, what are the functions of the institutions on Wall Street or Bay Street? And when you go back to the early 1930s, when America last had its big financial blowout, the reason you separated banks that were commercial banks that lent money to, you know, for people to buy a car, for people to buy a home, to start a business, from investment banks that were creating the vehicles for companies to raise equity and bonds to build their factories, and eventually to trade and do proprietary trading and developing their own. There was very different kinds of risks that affected the economy. So I think the reform around Wall Street has to be about separating those functions. And it raises the question whether it should be done here as well, because Canada had its version of the end of the Glass-Steagall when we brought banks and investment banks together.
So you got to put those walls back up, you think?
I think so. Because it's very tempting. I mean, there are some CEOs, I think Ed Clark's the classic example, of someone who said, you know what, we don't want to be in this business.
TD Bank, eh?
TD Bank. And so we don't want to be in this business. So we're going to create the wall, in a sense, on our own. And there are others that didn't, and that got, you know, reflected in how these banks performed during the financial downturn.
I'm inferring here, you're referring to the fact that TD did not get involved in the subprime meltdown and all that kind of thing. They were not exposed to that because Ed Clark
My
didn't want to get into it.
understanding is that Ed got them out of the business before it happened.
Yeah.
And he's done, I don't know if you've had him on your show.
Tried.
But you can Google ft.com, Financial Times of London, and he did a wonderful 15-minute interview where he basically walked through the process of how we got out of the business. And it's a classic case of a guy saying, you know what, we don't need the government to tell us not to be in this because there's something that I don't get about it, so I don't think we should be there. Well, so TD shareholders, we're lucky to have that CEO and other Canadian banks as well. But to step back from Krugman's point, Krugman's a bit of a populist economist. He's not the Nobel Peace Prize writing kind of economist that he was. It's easy to say, let's vilify one part of the economy and kick them. I think the challenge is to ask what it is you're trying to accomplish. That's the more important question. And it's not a question of hurting Wall Street. It's making sure that the degree to which you regulate a financial system, that what it does is lined up with the risks that are embedded in those particular companies.
Okay, follow up then. What is the sort of single most important piece of the regulatory puzzle that needs to be put back in place?
Well, I think they should end mortgage deductibility in the United States.
They're never going to do that.
Well, you asked me.
Okay, all right.
So you're asking me what is the most likely. So in other words, of all the things that they could do, I think it's pretty clear when we talk about the United States, and to a degree in Canada, is that we have to remove the risk that homes become a place for speculation.
So just so we're clear here, in the United States, we talked about this a bit yesterday.
Sure.
You can deduct your mortgage payments from your income tax.
Which encourages you to continue to buy bigger and bigger homes that
Right.
you may or may not be able to afford.
So if they removed that deductibility in the United States, it would not put added pressure on you to buy bigger and bigger. And
That's
probably
correct.
the Treasury would be a little fatter as well as a result of the loss of that loophole.
Well, we talked earlier also about the tax space in the United States. One of the challenges of regulation is just like new technologies, is there's intended and unintended consequences. you know, the regulators in the politicians in Bill Clinton's cabinet in 1994 who said we should increase home ownership in the United States probably didn't recognize that what they were doing is planting the seeds, along with all the other things that happened, for the tremendous meltdown that occurred in 08 and 09. So there were the unintended consequences where people bought homes that they couldn't afford. So how do you manage that? And the degree to which Wall Street takes advantage of some arbitrage opportunity in the marketplace, that's what they're paid to do.
Yeah.
So again, you know, if you're really concerned about how much money they make, then tax away their wealth, or make sure that there's a separation between the banks that are really important for how the economy needs to function. And this is the idea of ending the bailout mentality, because certainly in the United States, one of the biggest challenges for the regulators is to reduce this expectation that if we really blow it, we're going to get bailed out anyways. And all the evidence is that's how the U.S. behaves.
That is a beautiful segue to what we're going to talk about tomorrow, moral hazard. Come back for day 5, okay, Paul?
I look forward to it.
Thanks so much.